In the final hours of December 19, 1989, Panama was quiet in the uneasy way a place gets before something irreversible happens. The humidity hung low over Panama City, thick and unmoving, pressing down on rooftops, barracks, and apartment blocks. Most people were asleep. Some were not. At U.S. military bases scattered across the country, engines idled, radios crackled, and men checked their weapons one last time. In the dark skies above the isthmus, aircraft were already moving, blacked out, silent except for the low mechanical hum that blended into the night. By dawn, 27,000 American troops would be on Panamanian soil, and a small nation would wake up inside a war it never chose. For months, tension between the United States and Panama had been tightening like a drawn wire. At the center of it all was Manuel Noriega, the commander of the Panamanian Defense Forces, a man who had once been a valuable CIA asset and was now labeled a dictator, a drug trafficker, and an enemy of American interests. Noriega ruled Panama through fear, patronage, and a tight grip on the military. Elections were manipulated, protesters were beaten, journalists were intimidated, or worse. To Washington, he had become unpredictable and embarrassing, a former ally who no longer followed instructions. The immediate trigger came on December 16th, when a U.S. Marine lieutenant was killed at a PDF checkpoint in Panama City. Another American officer and his wife were detained and allegedly abused. President George H.W. Bush went on television shortly afterward and announced that the situation had crossed a line. The safety of American citizens was at risk, democracy in Panama had been crushed, and Noriega himself had been indicted in U.S. courts on drug trafficking charges. The decision had already been made. The invasion was coming. It was called Operation Just Cause, a name chosen to frame what followed as necessary and moral. But for the people on the ground, names meant nothing compared to what they were about to experience. Shortly after midnight on December 20th, the first bombs fell. U.S. Air Force F-117 stealth fighters struck key military targets with precision-guided munitions. At the same time, AC-130 gunships began circling over Panama City, their cannons lighting up the night with streams of fire. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division poured out of transport planes over Tocumen Airport, landing under heavy fire as tracers stitched the darkness around them. This was one of the largest airborne assaults since World War II, and it was happening in a densely populated urban environment. Within hours, American forces attacked more than 24 objectives across the country. PDF barracks, airfields, command centers, and police stations were hit almost simultaneously. The goal was speed and shock, to overwhelm Panama's military before it could organize a coordinated response. For many Panamanian soldiers, the invasion came as a complete surprise. Some fought back fiercely, others fled, some simply went home. In neighborhoods like El Chorrillo, the fighting was especially intense. The area surrounded the Comandancia, Noriega's headquarters, and the symbolic heart of his power. U.S. forces moved in with tanks, infantry, and heavy firepower. The PDF defenders were dug in, and the battle quickly turned brutal. Fires broke out and spread from building to building. Wooden homes went up in flames, trapping families inside. Civilians ran through the streets carrying children, possessions, anything they could grab, as bullets snapped overhead. By morning, large sections of El Chorrillo were smoldering ruins. For American troops, many of them young and on their first combat deployment, the invasion was a chaotic blur of noise, adrenaline, and fear. Training kicked in, but nothing fully prepares you for the reality of urban warfare. The enemy did not always wear uniforms. Gunfire came from windows, rooftops, alleyways. Orders changed rapidly as units encountered unexpected resistance. Some objectives were taken quickly. Others turned into hours-long firefights. Casualties mounted on both sides. Meanwhile, Noriega himself vanished. As his defenses collapsed, he slipped away, moving between safe houses, trying to stay ahead of U.S. forces that were now hunting him specifically. The invasion had multiple stated goals, but capturing Noriega was central. Without him, the regime would collapse completely. American psychological operations units blasted rock music and propaganda messages over loudspeakers, urging PDF soldiers to surrender and mocking Noriega's authority. Leaflets rained down from helicopters. The message was clear. This was over. By the second day, organized resistance had largely ended. The Panamanian Defense Forces, long more feared than respected, disintegrated under the weight of the assault. Thousands surrendered. Others blended into civilian life. American troops fanned out across the country, securing infrastructure, guarding government buildings, and restoring a semblance of order. Guillermo Endara, the man widely believed to have won Panama's annulled election earlier that year, was sworn in as president on a U.S. military base, a moment that symbolized both liberation and foreign control. But the cost of the invasion was becoming impossible to ignore. Official U.S. figures later put American casualties at 23 killed and around 325 wounded. Panamanian military deaths were estimated in the hundreds. Civilian casualties remain far more disputed. Human rights groups and local organizations claim that several hundred, possibly thousands, of civilians were killed, particularly in areas like El Chorrillo. Many were buried in unmarked graves. Entire communities were displaced overnight, left to pick through ashes where their homes once stood. International reaction was swift and largely negative. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the invasion as a violation of international law. Latin American countries denounced it as imperialism dressed up as intervention. Even some U.S. allies expressed discomfort. In Washington, however, the operation was declared a success. The objectives had been met. Noriega was on the run. American lives, officials said, had been protected. Democracy, they argued, was being restored. For Noriega, the end came not with a last stand, but with a strange, almost surreal standoff. On December 24th, he sought refuge in the Apostolic Nunciature, the Vatican's diplomatic mission in Panama City. U.S. forces surrounded the building but could not legally enter. Instead, they turned to psychological pressure, blasting loud rock music day and night, flooding the area with soldiers and lights, making sleep impossible. After 10 days, Noriega surrendered. He was flown to the United States in handcuffs, where he would be tried, convicted, and sentenced to decades in prison. In the aftermath, Panama was changed forever. The PDF was dissolved, replaced by a civilian police force. U.S. troops remained for months, helping stabilize the country and oversee the transition. Billions of dollars in aid were promised, though recovery was uneven and slow. For some Panamanians, the invasion meant the end of a brutal regime and a chance at real democracy. For others, it was a traumatic reminder of how little control small nations have when caught in the path of superpower decisions. For the American military, Operation Just Cause became a case study. It showcased new technologies, rapid deployment, and joint operations between different branches of the armed forces. Lessons learned in Panama would later be applied in the Gulf War just over a year later. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about civilian casualties, proportional force, and the long-term consequences of intervention. Those debates never fully faded. Decades later, the night of December 20th, 1989, still echoes in Panama. Survivors remember the sound of gunfire and explosions, the confusion, the fear, the sudden realization that their world had been shattered while they slept. Veterans remember the faces of comrades, the weight of their gear, the smell of smoke and cordite in narrow streets far from home. History records the invasion in dates, numbers, and official statements. But its true legacy lives in those memories, carried quietly by people on both sides of the fight. Because in the end, it all came down to a single night when overwhelming force met human lives, and the course of a nation was rewritten before the sun could rise.